Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Have you ever played Super Mario 64? Because wowza, does that game really capture the feeling of playing as Mario. Just the way he jumps off walls and flips backwards to face the camera before falling into a headfirst dive is just full of the exaggerated swagger of an Italian plumber. May I present to you Super Mario 64, the iconic mustachioed plumber's first full adventure in 3D. Released on June 23, 1996 in Japan, with a North American release later in September of that same year, Super Mario 64 was one of the very few launch titles for Nintendo's first ever fully 3D home console, the Nintendo 64. I knew this wasn't a toaster. After Sony had entered the console race with their first home video game console, the PlayStation, Nintendo finally had more competent competition than ever before. And after the failure of... let's just say Nintendo knew that they were going to need something big to launch with their new console. And who better than Nintendo's flagship character? The N64 began development in 1993, only 1 year before the release of the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn. So it was kinda obvious that Nintendo was going to be playing catch-up. However, as soon as they could, they began development on a Mario launch title for the system, which was still under the codename Project Reality. Director and producer Shigeru Miyamoto had already been thinking up ideas for a 3D Mario game in the early 1990s when he was designing the Super Nintendo's Star Fox. But it wasn't until September 1994 that development for Super Mario 64 actually started. Almost 2.5 years later, on May 20th, 1996, development finished with a final launch date of June 23, 1996. During development, the team of roughly 15 to 20 people primarily prioritized Mario's movements and how he would handle in 3D areas. The team would test Mario's physics, controls, animations, and interactability on a grid with a golden rabbit the team named MIPS. MIPS was named after the N64's MIPS architecture processors, or MIPS architecture processors. I'll name you NVIDIA 1070 Ti. During development, the team even considered multiplayer, with having the second player play as Luigi in a split-screen co-op kind of thing. However, they never got it to function the way they wanted it to, and decided to scrap the idea entirely, but Luigi would make an appearance in the 2004 remake for the Nintendo DS. But more on that later. Always remember, Luigi, your older sibling's more important than you. Super Mario 64 was developed simultaneously alongside The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, and since Ocarina of Time was taking longer to develop, the Mario team decided to use some of the puzzles for their own game. Every parent has their favorite child. The game was originally planned to feature 32 courses. Miyamoto, who was hoping for 40, was constantly pushing for more in the game, causing it to be delayed from the original release of Christmas 1995 to a later date of April 1996. The game was then given another 2-month delay and ultimately released with a total of 15 levels. This was much less than planned, but the team had focused on making each level replayable multiple times and encouraged exploration. The game was met with critical praise and was considered one of, if not the best game of 1996. The game was praised for its simple yet wonderfully charming presentation, intuitive controls, and overall highly enjoyable experience. But was it a big enough game to help the N64 beat out the PlayStation? Nope! The PlayStation was way too ahead of the N64, and with glaring issues that the console had, like... As highly rated and wonderfully received as Super Mario 64 was, it wasn't a big enough push the console needed to beat the PlayStation. That being said, even though the N64 wasn't the cool, interesting console of that generation, Super Mario 64 is still way more fondly looked upon these days than most PS1 games. The game effectively launched the Mario series in a whole new direction, and essentially invented the 3D platformer. It wasn't technically the first 3D game ever made, but it's widely considered to basically have been. The game was one of the very few series that didn't have a hard time transitioning from 2D to 3D. Sonic the Hedgehog, which was a considerable rival to Mario in the 90s, had quite a hard time making it to 3D until Sonic Adventure was released in December of 1998. Super Mario 64 is one of the best games of all time, and it helped move games into the future of 3D. In fact, the game still holds up really well today, aside from some of the camera controls, which can be frustrating at times. However, despite that one small issue, the game is an absolute classic. It's wildly fun to play and every level is so memorable, Bob-Omb Battlefield, Cool Mountain, Dire Docks, Whomp's Fortress. The hub world of Peach's Castle is iconic and simply genius. The game didn't follow the simple linear structure that the past Mario games had, and instead opted for the player to freely choose the levels and how to obtain the main collectible, stars. Super Mario 64 is an all-time classic, and it's very close to my heart. It's a game that I enjoyed playing for hours and hours as a kid, just running around in expansive playground-like worlds. And it's a game I frequently come back to just for the simple platforming fun. However, the original N64 version is not the only version that exists. In fact, I mostly played the Nintendo DS version as a kid. So how does it feel to be a launch title twice? May I present to you Super Mario 64 DS, a launch title for the Nintendo DS released in North America on November 21st, 2004. What's the difference? Well, for one, I can't fit this into my DS. And for two, notice how the games look quite different from each other? Yep, that's right, this ain't no movie magic. Super Mario 64 DS wasn't a port of the original N64 classic, it was a remake.
You don't always have to make it so obvious, Square.
Super Mario 64 for the DS featured loads of changes, from the addition of 30 new stars, local multiplayer, minigames, edited level designs, updated character models, and the biggest change of them all. Super Mario 64 DS's biggest feature was the fact that you could now play as not only Mario, but also as Yoshi, Luigi, and Wario. The game also featured some entirely new levels and bosses. The game was an instant hit and is one of the best-selling DS games to date. However, that's not to say the game didn't have a few issues.
You see this? Now look at this.
Do you notice something that's on this controller that's not on this? Yeah, a big problem about playing Super Mario 64 on the DS is the fact that the DS doesn't have a control stick. It literally only has the D-pad to control movement. And using a D-pad to control movement in a 3D game? I mean, who does that? At least it's not something stupid like the touchscreen.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, this was a bizarre choice. Even though that's very in character for Nintendo, it still feels odd, especially considering it was a selling point that Nintendo loved to flaunt about during the marketing of the game. Clearly they wanted to show off how the DS used the touchscreen, but this is just stupid. I don't believe I have ever seen anyone use the touch controls for Super Mario 64 DS. It's just so awkward and confusing to handle. It's much easier to just hold it normally. However, the minimap on the bottom screen is a very nice addition. So, which version is better? Honestly, both have their own merits. However, being a kind of purist with some games, I'd argue that the original N64 version is my personal favorite pick. I just enjoy how the game controls much better on the original N64 controller, and I love the old, chunky, outdated models on the characters. It's a fun part of history, and I like seeing where the 3D Mario series has come from and how it's evolved over the years. I also love the speedrunning capabilities in the original US version of the game. Super Mario 64 is one of the easiest and most speedrun games out there, and I've dabbled in a bit of it myself. However, when it comes to the sheer amount of content, the DS version reigns supreme. With the addition of new levels, multiple playable characters, fun new levels, and side content, Super Mario 64 DS is the version you want to go to get the most bang for your buck. No matter which version though, Super Mario 64 will always be a classic, and known for how it revolutionized the gaming industry with its creative, fun gameplay and how it created the entire 3D platforming genre. And I must say, I think that's why I got these two mixed up. Just like how the toaster revolutionized how we as human beings eat bread, Mario 64 revolutionized how games are made.
That being said, I should probably get a new toaster.